The roar of 20,000 voices crashed against the steel ribs of the Astrodome, spotlights slicing the darkness in jagged beams of white and gold. Elvis Presley was in full flight, guitar slung low, hips pivoting, voice ringing through jailhouse rock, when a sudden piercing sob cut through the anthem like a knife. In the front row, illuminated in a single shaft of light, stood a 5-year-old girl clutching a matted teddy bear to her tiny chest. Her dress, once pastel pink, was smudged with dust and tears. She looked around in terrified confusion, eyes wide, searching the sea of faces for a hand to hold, her mother lost somewhere in the frantic crowd. Back on stage, Elvis's grin faded. His next chord hung incomplete as he tilted his head, spotting the child's distress at his feet. The drummer's sticks hovered over the snares. The trumpet section paused mid-breath. For the first time in his career, the king of rock and roll did something no one expected. He set his guitar aside, raised a single hand, and the Astrodome stilled. Every cheer died, every light seemed to dim. 20,000 strangers, bound by excitement moments before, fell silent. And in that hush, profound, unshakable, Elvis stepped forward down the catwalk, his cape trailing like a shadow, ready to transform a spectacle into an act of compassion that would echo through the years. A low roar pulsed through the Houston Astrodome, sweeping across 20,000 souls like a rolling tide. Neon lights danced off the curved ceiling, splashing electric blues and greens over the sea of faces. In the center of it all, Elvis Presley stood beneath a scorch of white spotlights, his black hair glistening with sweat, voice rippling through the cavernous space. He was midway through Jailhouse Rock, hips swiveling, voice soaring, when a single plaintive cry cut through the orchestrated thunder. Elvis hesitated, mid-step, guitar dangling from its strap. The rhythm section's snare drum snapped to a stop. The orchestra's trumpets trailed off into silence. In the front row, where bandanas and cowboy hats brimmed the aisles, a small figure trembled, clutching a matted teddy bear. A little girl, no more than 5, stood alone among a crowd 10 times her size. Her pale dress, once fluffy and pristine, was dirt-smudged at the hem. Huge floodlights honed in on her quivering lip as she searched the sea of faces. For a heartbeat, 2 decades of arena anthems hung suspended. Then, without a word, Elvis set his guitar aside and raised a single hand. The hush that followed was thunderous. 20,000 people fallen silent, as though the dome itself had exhaled in relief. From the wings, stagehands froze mid-stride. The stage crew's scanner crackled uncertainly, as if the soundboard itself refused to betray the hush. Somewhere in the middle rows, a fan clutched an aged ticket stub, knuckles white. In that grand amphitheater, built for spectacle and uproar, the hush felt sacred and fragile. Elvis glanced down at the child, then back to the barrier, where 2 burly security guards were exchanging panicked glances. He strode forward, no entourage trailing, no manager in tow, his custom-sequined jacket gleaming like a fallen star. With measured steps, he descended the catwalk toward the girl, each footfall echoing into the quiet like a heartbeat. The audience remained motionless, a tableau of stunned reverence. Not a single camera shutter dared to click. In every direction, eyes were fixed on the king, who knelt before the small stranger. The stark contrast of his towering frame and her fragile form was almost tangible, the embodiment of power bending to tenderness. "How old are you, sweetheart?" Elvis asked, voice gentle but carrying across the hushed arena. His microphone waited unused on the stage. This moment needed no amplification. The girl dabbed at her tears with the teddy bear's ear, eyes downcast. A soft sob slipped out. "LLL," she stammered, voice quivering. "Mommy." He lifted her chin, his fingers as light as a breeze. "Where's your mom?" he asked, scanning the rows beyond the barrier, where faces blurred into shadows. The security guard at his side leaned in, whispering that the child's mother had been separated in the crush at the concourse entrance. A murmur rippled through the crowd, concern, then solidarity. Without prompting, volunteers in the crowd, women in polyester dresses, men in Western suits, began to call out directions. "Aisle 7, Concourse B," others pointed, guiding yellow-jacketed ushers toward the exits. It was no longer a concert, but a rescue, choreographed by collective empathy. Elvis scooped the girl into his arms, wrapping his sequined jacket around her shoulders like a protective shawl. She nestled against him, teddy bear clutched to her chest, as he rose and turned to the audience. His jaw was set, and in his eyes shone a steadfast resolve that matched the floodlight's glare. "We're taking a break," he announced, voice resonant and calm. "Right now, we've got something more important to find." His southern drawl spread over the arena like comfort. At his signal, the band faded into the wings, the drum kit and piano swallowed by darkness. Not one instrument dared to intrude on that moment. Elvis carried the girl back toward the barrier, her tiny boots brushing the metal rail. Security cleared a path, and over the stadium loudspeakers a gentle call went out. "Please, remain seated. We're reuniting a lost child with her mother." The recorded voice quavered slightly, an echo of the girl's earlier sob. Somewhere in the upper decks, a mother's gasp cut through the quiet. A frantic shout, "Maggie! Maggie! Over here!" The little girl's head snapped up as a disheveled woman burst through a cordon of ushers, tears streaming, arms outstretched. She ran, weaving through the aisle, and gathered her daughter in a desperate embrace. The teddy bear fell, and the girl knelt, puppy-like in relief, burying her face against her mother's shoulder. Elvis lingered, giving them space, then stepped back onto the catwalk. The crowd rose as one, 20,000 people standing not in applause but in gratitude, honor, and awe. Stadium lights brightened, revealing tear-streaked faces and glistening eyes all around. From his vantage point, Elvis let the enormity of the moment sink in before speaking again. "Ain't nothing more precious than family," he said, voice steady. "Let's never forget that." Then, as if an invisible cue had been met, the orchestra launched into a soft, reverent rendition of "You'll Never Walk Alone." Elvis watched the reunited pair leave the barrier, then turned back to the piano, his expression softened but resolute. 20,000 voices joined in, not in uproar, but in a hushed hymn of unity. In that single, unprecedented pause in his Astrodome show, Elvis Presley had given the deepest performance of his career, not with a song, but with a simple act of compassion that resonated far beyond the roar of any crowd. Elvis Presley's customary flourish halted mid-riff as the Astrodome's cavernous void swallowed the final echo of Jailhouse Rock. He stood at the lip of the stage, silhouette carved by the white-hot beam, guitar forgotten at his side. Without a word, he slipped off the platform and navigated the narrow catwalk that divided the orchestra pit from the screaming stands. 20,000 pairs of eyes tracked his descent in stunned silence. Backstage, the stagehands had paused mid-stride, wires coiling around their ankles, as if the very mechanics of the show had sensed his departure. Under the harsh glow of dressing room corridors, the normally crackling walkie-talkies fell mute. Security guards stationed at the barrier exchanged urgent whispers, none with the authority to halt the king of rock and roll. At the barrier's edge, two brawny ushers parted the sea of seats, fashioning a corridor for Elvis's unannounced pilgrimage. The little girl, clutching her worn teddy bear, quivered against the metal rail. Her tear-streaked cheeks glistened under the arena lights, and her wide eyes fixed on the descending legend. For one heartbeat, the crowd remembered why they had paid to see this man, not for gyrating hips or booming vocals, but for moments like this, when the king became simply a man of compassion. Elvis knelt beside her, smoothing a stray curl from her damp forehead. He draped his sequined jacket around her shoulders, the fabric warm and heavy like a protective blanket. The girl's sobs subsided, her head resting against his chest, as the murmurs of recognition rippled through the stands. "Hey there, little lady," Elvis said, voice soft yet resonant. "What's your name?" His Tennessee drawl carried through the hush, intimate as prayer. She sniffled, voice wavering. "Emily." "Eliza, no, sorry, Emily," he clarified gently, then offered his hand. She took it tentatively, as though unsure whether miracles were real. He hoisted her into his arms, cradling her against his sequins, and rose to his full height. At that moment, the bandleader, perched behind a gleaming drum kit, tapped his cymbals twice, once for readiness, twice for order, and the orchestra fell silent. On cue, the sound engineers reopened the barriers to the concourse, dispatching ushers to search for the child's mother. Above the hush, Elvis raised the microphone, though his nearest stagehand gestured to cut the PA line. Tonight's show had morphed into something more sacred than amplified music. Undeterred, Elvis spoke softly but clearly. "Folks, we got a little lady here who needs her mama. Let's give 'em a moment to find each other." The crowd responded not with cheers, but with an outpouring of empathy. Somewhere in the upper deck, a voice rang out, "Mommy's here!" It was a mother's plea, brittle with panic and relief. Ushers pointed down the aisles, their fluorescent vests gleaming as they guided a frantic woman toward the stage barricade. Elvis shifted Emily in his arms, rocking her gently. The mother, a young woman with bright eyes rimmed red, pushed through the crowd, arms outstretched. As she reached the barrier, the ushers parted, and she knelt beside Elvis. "Thank you," she breathed, voice catching. "I'm so sorry." Elvis smiled, a quiet curve that spoke of relief rather than rebuke. "It's all right," he said, tone warm and kindly. "She's safe now." He handed Emily to her mother, the little girl burying her face against her mother's shoulder, clutching the teddy bear as though it were a lifeline. Elvis remained kneeling, eyes glistening in the glare of the spotlights. For a moment, the mother and daughter formed a tableau of gratitude at his feet. Then he rose, patted the mother's hand, and stepped back toward the stage, leaving behind the barrier now strewn with lost teddy bears and discarded ticket stubs. In the stands, an uncharacteristic standing ovation rippled through the audience, not for the guitar solos they'd come to expect, but for the king's act of humanity. No applause track, no encore call, just the collective recognition that music could wait. Back on stage, Elvis donned his guitar like an old friend, and without resuming the set list, nodded to the band leader. At his signal, the orchestra launched into a subdued piano introduction. Elvis closed his eyes, drew the neck of his guitar to his chest, and sang, "You'll Never Walk Alone," with a tenderness that transcended entertainment. Those first notes, warm, unadorned, wafted out into the silent Colosseum, weaving compassion into every corner. As the last refrain faded, Elvis offered a lone salute, fingers to temple, a gesture both regal and humble, before breaking into his signature grin. The roof of the Astrodome seemed to lift under the roar that followed, thunderous approval that celebrated not the voice, but the heart behind it. In that single, unscripted interlude, Elvis Presley had transformed a spectacle into sanctuary, reminding 20,000 fans, and countless others who would hear the tale, that sometimes the greatest love songs are those written in action, not in lyrics. The hush that fell over the Astrodome after Elvis Presley slipped off the stage was absolute, as though someone had flipped a switch and drained 20,000 souls of sound. The band, halted mid-riff, stood motionless under the glare of spotlights. A single spotlight tracked the king's steady stride down the ramp, cutting through the sea of frozen bodies, until he knelt before a little girl clinging to her bear. Security guards parted the crowd like a slow-opening flower, clearing a narrow path. Elvis rose, teddy bear still cradled in his left arm, and drew a breath that seemed to harness all the compassion in his heart. He lifted the bear's paw and tucked it into the crook of his elbow, then scooped the girl into his arms. She wrapped her arms around his neck, muffling her hiccups against the glitter of his costume. The roar he had been delivering moments before was replaced by a silent river of concern that flowed outward from the stage. Rather than summon the PA system, Elvis carried the girl to the edge of the stage and sat on his heels, the waves of faces barely visible beyond the girthy metal barrier. He held her close, rocking gently, and began to hum, softly at first, a tentative whisper of melody. His voice slipped into the first verse of Love Me Tender, but instead of the full orchestration, only the faintest piano notes emerged from a lone keyboard set just off stage. Love me tender, love me sweet, never let me go. Each line hung in the still air, more potent for its simplicity. Elvis's vibrato carried the weight of reassurance, his Tennessee drawl smooth as velvet. The girl's sobs slowed, her shoulders unbunched, as the audience leaned in, drawn by the unexpected intimacy. No camera flash dared puncture the moment. Somewhere in the stands, a child angled her head to listen. A grandmother pressed her hand to her heart, every single pair of eyes fixed on the pair, guardian and rescued. Minutes passed, time draped in velvet hush, until a ripple of movement broke the silence. From the concourse beyond the crowd, a voice called out, "Martha! Martha Lee! Over here!" It quivered at the edges, part fear, part hope. Ushers in bright jackets parted the sea of people, guiding a disheveled young mother toward the stage barrier. Her hands flew to her face, tears carving glittering tracks down her cheeks as she broke into a run. Elvis, still seated, turned his head and spotted the woman. He smiled gently at the girl, pressed a kiss to her curl-topped forehead, and then stood, easing the child from his arms. "There she is," he murmured, voice rich with relief. The little girl scrambled forward, clutching her teddy as she sprinted into her mother's embrace. The two collapsed together, arms flung around one another, as though terrified the other might vanish again. A few timid claps erupted, shifting into a wave of applause that built not with the frenzied energy of a pop concert, but with the reverent hush of a sanctuary. People rose to their feet, many wiping misted eyes, honoring the reunion that transcended the usual give and take of performer and spectator. The light softened overhead, shifting from stark white to a gentle amber, as though the dome itself conferred its blessing. Elvis stepped back to the center of the stage, tapping the frozen keyboard with a finger to summon the opening chords of "You'll Never Walk Alone." The familiar refrain poured forth, cello and piano weaving a warm tapestry of sound. Then his voice entered, firm, tender, unwavering. Walk on through the storm. Hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. He sang not for accolades, but as a benediction, a promise that, even amid life's scariest storms, one need not journey alone. The congregation of fans responded in kind, many rising in unison, voices muffled by tears yet unwavering in solidarity. In that sacred hush, every echo of Elvis's words felt like shared breath, a collective heartbeat, uniting performer and audience, child and parent, soul and song. When the final note faded, the dome remained suspended in silence for a heartbeat longer than common courtesy dictated. Then, with the slow inevitability of dawn, applause rose, soft at first, then unstoppable, rolling through the arena like a tide of gratitude. Elvis bowed his head, his hand over his heart, as the crowd honored the night's unscripted interlude more deeply than any hit single could command. Backstage, under the flicker of fluorescent lamps, Elvis removed his jacket and reached into the pocket where the little girl's teddy had brushed against the lining. He extracted a single rose, white, its petals delicate as hope, and placed it gently atop his sequined jumpsuit. As he prepared to return to the stage's bright lights, he carried with him more than a melody. He carried the quiet triumph of compassion, a reminder that sometimes the greatest power a performer wields is the simple choice to pause the show and put another's safety above his own stardom. The dawn light crept across the windows of Elvis Presley's four-season suite in Houston, painting the Persian rug in long stripes of gold and shadow. The previous night's Astrodome concert still reverberated in his memory, the hush, the rescue, the hymn that rose from 20,000 hearts. Now it hovered uneasily among the headlines that awaited him on the low marble table. A stack of local papers, national rags, and fan newsletters all clamoring to tell the world about Elvis's humanitarian interlude, King becomes savior, and Presley's pause turns ovation. He sat in a high-backed armchair, boots propped on the edge of the table, and picked up the Houston Chronicle. The front-page photograph captured the moment perfectly. Elvis, cape off his shoulders, jacket shielding a tearful little girl, the Astrodome's cavernous expanse receding behind them. The headline read, "Elvis halts show to rescue lost child. America's heart melts." Flipping to the second page, he found an editorial entitled, "Emotive Exploit or Genuine Concern." Its author wondered whether the king had orchestrated the drama for publicity. Elvis's jaw clenched as he scanned the cynical tone. No doubt the spectacle will translate into record sales. But how soon until the tears dry and the sequins resurface? He tossed the paper aside and grabbed the next one, USA Today. Its banner blazed, "King of Rock and Roll, King of Compassion." Below, a color photo of the tearful reunion captioned, "Mama's Here," and commentary on how the Astrodome crowd played along with the theatrics. Elvis's gaze grew cold, and he rose, pacing the room. The walls, adorned with his gold records and family snapshots, felt suddenly tight and suffocating. In the doorway stood Joe Esposito, concern etched in his features. "You see this?" Joe asked softly, nodding at the flurry of newspapers. "Elvis pulled them off for a kid," Joe continued. "Now the press wants a sequel. Interviews, photos, human interest angles. They're calling Martha Lee's phone non-stop." Elvis exhaled slowly, smoothing a crease in his shirt. "I told them," he flicked a hand toward Joe, "no cameras, no interviews. I didn't stop the show for headlines." But the media train had already left the station. A squad of reporters and photographers congregated in the hotel lobby, flashbulbs at the ready. Martha Lee and her daughter, still wrapped in Elvis's borrowed jacket, had checked into a corner suite under a pseudonym. Security had whispered their hiding place to the press, a leak from some well-meaning staffer desperate for the story of the year. Elvis made a decision. He strode to the phone and dialed the Chronicle's city desk. His voice, measured and low, carried the weight of authority. "This is Elvis Presley. Leave them alone. That child and her mother belong to each other, not your headlines. If you value your credibility, you'll respect their privacy." His words, though spoken quietly, crackled with a fierce resolve that left the editor stunned. Newspapers paused their presses. At least a dozen outlets pulled the stories or ran quiet retractions. Even the Sunday gossip columns backed off the bratty headline of tearjerker or tearjob. But not everyone retreated. Tabloid crews lurked near the valet stand. Freelance stringers lurked outside the hotel entrance. Their cameras clicked at every turn. That afternoon, as Elvis prepared for his next rehearsal in the ballroom, a courier delivered a small, unmarked envelope. No stamp, no return address, just his name in a child's scrawl. He slid it open and withdrew a single sheet of lined notebook paper, the edges frayed, the ink smudged. "Dear Mr. Presley, thank you for hugging me. I was so scared. Mommy says we're safe now because of you. Love, Sarah." His chest tightened. The letter's childlike loops and crooked margins spoke of trembling hands and tears still unshed. He folded it carefully and pressed it to his lips before tucking it into his breast pocket. For once, no script, no set list, no sequins mattered. Only those few words of gratitude. That evening, as the sun dipped behind Houston's skyline, Elvis walked the hotel corridor alone, the letter's warmth against his heart. He paused before the window overlooking the city lights, each car below a tiny beacon of ordinary lives. He realized then that the night's unplanned act had outpaced any choreographed spectacle he could stage. It had sparked genuine compassion in a cynical world. Back in his suite, he laid out his stage wardrobe, a row of gleaming jumpsuits, each begging to be shown off. But tonight, he reached for a simple black shirt and trousers. No sequins, no capes, just a man returning to what mattered: human connection. In the hush that settled over the darkened room, Elvis Presley whispered into the quiet, "They may steal my story, twist it for their pages, but they'll never steal her smile." And with that quiet conviction, he stepped into the next chapter of his tour, ready to sing once more, not for applause, but for moments that no headline could ever capture. The next night in Memphis, the atmosphere was electric with nostalgia and hometown pride. The stage lights glowed amber over the Orpheum Theater's gilded balconies and velvet seats. Echoes of Blue Suede Shoes and Heartbreak Hotel had already rippled through the old hall. Each number met with shouts and applause from fans who'd watched Elvis's broadcasts for years. But as the final chord of Hound Dog reverberated and the band eased into the introduction for Don't Be Cruel, something unexpected happened. A ripple of voices rose from the orchestra section. "Tell us about the girl," someone shouted, and immediately dozens more joined in the chant. The wave of calls swelled. "Tell us why you stopped." "Who was she?" "Ain't nothing like the king's compassion. Spill it." Elvis paused, guitar slung low, his silhouette dark against the sea of faces. The lights dimmed to a single warm spotlight, illuminating his profile. The band leader's eyebrows shot up as he watched Elvis raise a hand, just one finger, rhythmically, against the hush that followed. There was no brassy fanfare, no snare drum roll. In an instant, the hall stilled, the expectant hush rolling through balconies and boxes. Elvis's voice, unamplified, found its way to the back row. "There are things you can't tell with words," he said, tone even and calm. "They've got to be played." At his signal, the band shifted into the soft piano chords of Unchained Melody, a ballad chosen not for its drama, but for its quiet longing. The mournful strains filled the theater, unadorned by backup singers or heavy percussion. Elvis stepped forward, hands spread over the microphone stand, eyes closed. His voice entered the chorus, hushed yet powerful. "Oh, my love, my darling, I've hungered for your touch." The audience, still standing, listened as one living organism. Tears glistened in the eyes of elderly veterans in uniform. Young couples entwined their fingers. Children tucked their faces into parents' shoulders. In that fragile moment, no one felt a need to applaud, to cheer, to demand more. They simply sat, or stood, in reverent silence, letting the music carry the words left unspoken. When the final notes dissolved into the rafters, a solitary clap broke the quiet, then another, and soon the entire hall rose in a spontaneous ovation. But Elvis did not smile nor bask in the cheers. He gave a small nod of appreciation and stepped back, letting the band gently segue into the next song, Bridge Over Troubled Water, its promise of comfort, a fitting capstone to the evening's unexpected turning. Backstage, the atmosphere shifted from the adrenaline of performance to the hush of reflection. In the dim glow of dressing room sconces, crew members quietly packed cables and changed set lists. The scent of sweat and stale cologne mingled with the metallic tang of drink orders left on folding chairs. Joe Esposito found Elvis seated at a small table, fingers still drumming the rhythm of Unchained Melody on the worn laminate. "Why didn't you answer them?" Joe asked softly, concern wrinkling his brow. "Those people wanted a story." Elvis looked up, eyes shadowed and thoughtful. He tapped the tabletop twice, ba-dum, ba-dum, then folded his hands. "Because it's not about me," he began, voice low. "It's about a scared little girl who got lost in a sea of strangers." He paused, gaze drifting to a framed photo on the dressing room wall. A faded snapshot of young Elvis at a county fair in Tupelo, Mississippi. Eyes bright but wary amid carnival lights. "When I was 5, he continued, "I wandered away from my folks at the state fair. One minute I was chasing a cotton candy stick. The next, I was alone, the rides towering above me like giants. The hurt of not seeing my mother's face for what felt like forever, it never really left me." His words trembled just slightly, the vulnerability raw and human. That girl in Houston, it was like looking in a mirror years later. I couldn't tell her how it felt. All I could do was hold her and let the music speak the words I couldn't find. Joe exhaled, leaning back against the wall. "So you sang for her," he said, voice hushed. "Not for the crowd." Elvis nodded, eyes distant. "Yeah, and you know what? I want to find her again. Not on front pages, not under flashbulbs, but quietly, just to make sure she's okay." He folded the napkin he'd used to dab at his forehead and set it beside a Rolex and a half-empty glass of scotch. "If fate ever brings us back together, I'll be there." Joe placed a hand on his shoulder. "When you're ready, we'll make it happen." The dressing room lights flickered as a stagehand passed by, cueing the next act for the late-night encore. Elvis stood and brushed the artificial sweat from his jacket, shoulders squared with quiet resolve. No headline chase, no scripted interview would come of this. Only a promise held close to his heart, one that transcended any microphone. He opened the door and stepped into the corridor. The echo of his footsteps, a gentle rhythm, to match the steadfast beat of his own conviction. In the hush behind the stage, he walked forward, not as an icon of spectacle, but as a man haunted by his own childhood fear, and driven to ensure no other child ever endures it alone. Elvis Presley's final Las Vegas engagement of 1976 felt more intimate than any he had ever undertaken. The showroom at the Hilton was clad in red velvet drapes and polished brass fittings, yet tonight the gilding seemed to fade beneath an undercurrent of anticipation. For weeks, rumors had swirled backstage that this would be a night unlike any other, a private affair for longtime fans with no television cameras, just a man and a stage. As Elvis adjusted the simple black collar of his shirt, he felt the weight of months of touring settle around his shoulders like an old coat. Earlier that afternoon, when the crew wheeled in the Steinway upright for the acoustic set, Elvis had paused to inspect the keys, tracing each ivory surface with a fingertip in quiet recognition of the instrument's history. Behind him, Joe Esposito intercepted a small group of stage hands. "Keep it tight," he whispered. "Nobody's here to see grins and glitter. Tonight's for something else." Their nods were respectful, aware that the king's purpose had shifted from spectacle to something more profound. As the house lights dimmed and the audience, 2,500 souls crammed into the showroom, fell silent, Elvis stepped into the single shaft of amber light that cut through the haze of vanilla-scented smoke. He carried no guitar, but wore around his neck a silver locket he had never performed in before, its exterior engraved with the words, "You're never alone." Inside lay a tiny, faded drawing of a teddy bear, an echo of the Houston Astrodome moment that had rippled through his life. He greeted the crowd not with a booming "thank you," but with a simple nod, eyes cast downward, voice soft yet unwavering. "Good evening," he said. "This song, it's for an old friend I met backstage. A girl you all helped me find. She brought this locket. She said it keeps her safe when she's afraid." A murmur swept through the audience, a collective intake of breath. Near the back, a veteran of his earlier tours tipped his hat, remembering the Astrodome hush. A mother in the balcony steadied her baby, recalling the fragility of small hands in a sea of faces. Elvis moved to the piano, fingers brushing the first key, as though greeting a dear companion. The hush descended into a heavier quiet than any orchestral rest. He began "Bridge Over Troubled Water," not one of his usual numbers, but chosen for its promise of support, its refrain of steadfast solace. "When you're weary, feeling small, when tears are in your eyes, I will dry them all." His voice entered the melody with a vulnerability that had been absent from his Vegas shows for years. Each verse was imbued with the weight of personal memory. The lost child in Houston, the scattered lines of tabloid suspicion, the gentle assurance held in a small girl's letter. Elvis's hands moved lightly, chords falling like whispered prayers. At the line, "Like a bridge over troubled water, I will lay me down." His voice trembled, and for a moment, the musicians behind him, guitars, bass, light percussion, paused in deference. The room held its breath as though time itself waited on the king's next note. Then the band leader, eyes moist, guided them back in, weaving a cushion of sound that cradled Elvis's vocals without overwhelming them. When the final refrain faded, Elvis closed his eyes. The hush that followed his last note was absolute, deeper than any echo of applause could ever be. No one exhaled. No one moved. Even the whispering heat of the showroom lights seemed to suspend. Then, as though Simon had given a silent nod, the crowd rose, 12,500 people, standing in unison, not to cheer, but to honor a quiet communion between performer and soul. Backstage, under the quiet whir of ventilation fans, Elvis sat at his dressing room mirror and removed the silver locket. In the enclosed space, he opened it gently. Inside lay the simple pencil sketch of a teddy bear, and, folded beneath it, a small creased note in childish scrawl. "Thank you for keeping me safe. When I'm afraid, I hold this close and imagine your arms around me. I'm never alone." He traced the child's loops of ink with his fingertip and pressed the locket to his lips in a silent benediction. He tucked it back around his neck, fastening it over the satin lining of his jacket, its message a vow he carried beyond the dressing room walls. That night, as Elvis strode back onto the showroom floor for his final bow, the gilded proscenium seemed to recede. In its place stood every small, trembling heart he had touched, and every one he had yet to reach. The king did not raise his arms to call for an encore or a final cheer. Instead, he stood straight, lifted his gaze to the silent crowd, and simply looked, acknowledging each soul who had listened when words weren't enough. In the quiet that followed, more powerful than any crescendo, Elvis Presley slipped backstage for the last time, leaving behind more than a performance, the living testament that sometimes the greatest music lies in the unspoken promise that no one ever walks alone.